So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Ner Yisrael and Raleigh Close series of Shiurim. We're delighted Rabbi Zobin is speaking tonight on anti-Semitism, a Torah perspective, and we're grateful for all the support that Rabbi Zobin always provides to our series of Shiurim. We have one dedication. Shiur is dedicated to Nishmas Miriam Bas Binyamin, Zichrona Levracha, the mother of Naomi Landy and Ruth Pollock, whose yahrzeit was the 6th of Tammuz. I hand over now to Rabbi Zobin, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you not just for that introduction, but to you and to the whole committee, both those from Ner Yisrael and from Raleigh Close, for both organising these Shiurim and for inviting me to speak. As always, honoured to do so, and the importance of this series of Shiurim is difficult to overstate. It's a very special occasion that we can get together as neighbouring communities, as sistering communities with our partners and our friends who are really close, and I'm really pleased to be able to speak to everyone. I'm going to post actually in the chat, for those who are interested, a source sheet which you can just click on, and you'll have the sources that I will use. But equally, I'll try and share with the screen as I reference different topics. So I'll try and give multiple means to people to follow what I'm talking about. I have put in the chat a link to some sources. And as Susan said, my topic today is anti-Semitism, a Torah perspective, and I really want to look at both understanding a little bit about what anti-Semitism is, and also share some thoughts around responses, appropriate responses to it. I am very conscious that this is a sensitive topic. It's sensitive because it's really very real and personal. Many of us may have experienced anti-Semitism in different shapes and forms. We're obviously conscious of both recent and more distant Jewish history, and the pain and suffering that has been associated with this. It's difficult to talk about also because it's a complicated subject, and by definition, anything I'm able to say about it in the sort of 3/4 of an hour available will be somewhat superficial and somewhat oversimplifying what really is enormously complicated. It's complicated in terms of the history, the sociology, understanding the phenomena, and certainly trying to probe its roots and what it's about and where it comes from. It's difficult and sensitive in its Torah insight and understanding what really the Torah has to say on the subject. So I'm conscious as I speak that this is a difficult and personal and sensitive topic, and I would say please, if people feel anything I say deserves to be questioned or challenged or asked about, please feel free to do so. You can use the chat feature, you can use the Zoom option of raising your hands, and I will try and give people a chance to ask questions, and I'll also try and finish near the end with some time for further questions. I also want to stress that as much as we worry about anti-Semitism at the moment, and I think all of us do, it would be wrong to exaggerate. We are thankfully living in a golden age by any measure. We're living in a wonderful country, in a country that is exceptionally open, welcoming, has welcomed us historically and continues to welcome us. We are in a country where the government and the police and the authorities are there by our sides and looking after us. It is unfortunate that there are still all too many anti-Semitic incidents, but equally we are not in a situation of defenselessness, of powerlessness. Not only do we have our national home, our collective home, the State of Israel, but here in the diaspora we live in a Malchus Shel Chesed, truly in a country of kindness that values all of its citizens and appreciates us as part of the quilt, part of the medley of English life. And I think it's important that when starting this topic, we contextualize our experiences and realize when we look at the sweep of Jewish history, we really are living in a time of exceptional safety and protection and of valued citizens of this land. I also am conscious as I speak that in attempting to understand the phenomena of anti-Semitism, one can slip into two traps. One can understand the persecutor, the anti-Semite, and in so doing somehow appear to justify what is a repugnant and evil viewpoint and perspective. And equally, one can end up in trying to understand it in somehow being perceived as blaming the victim. And certainly, neither of those two extremes are my intention. And therefore, again, I would emphasize, if anything I say is misunderstood or raises questions, please do feel free to ask. Having said that we are living in a golden age of Jewish history, nonetheless, it is exceptionally sad that we do still need to talk about this topic, that anti-Semitism is a subject at all. 80 years after the Holocaust and the education and legislation and dialogue that has gone on, it's truly heartbreaking that we do need to discuss this at all, and this is still a phenomenon that exists. I saw quoted in the name of a Harvard scholar, someone called Ruth Weiss, who said that anti-Semitism was the most successful ideology of the 20th century, meaning to say that whilst fascism has gone and communism has gone, anti-Semitism as a pernicious and evil ideology has lingered and remained, and that's truly a sad situation. It's sad that this needs to be said. So let's first try and define what anti-Semitism is, what we mean by anti-Semitism. It's clear it doesn't mean just not liking Jews, individual Jews. We all kind of have people that we don't like. I'm not going to go into the issue of what is or isn't legitimate criticism of Israel, and certainly we can recognize that disagreeing with particular policies of the Israeli government isn't anti-Semitism. What it means is denying the right of Jews to exist, whether individually or collectively. The label anti-Semitism, as we're aware, is essentially the hatred of Jews, whether by those outside the Semitic nations or those who are part of Semitic people. And what makes it unique is because it's very difficult really to explain and to understand its roots. It's got a consistency about it. It's a phenomena that spans time and geographical space, and seems to carry within it a lot of contradictions. Sometimes it's understood to be natural phenomena of persecuting the weak. Other times it's about Jews being strong. They have unique evil powers of strength. Sometimes Jews are hated for being capitalists. Other times for being communists. Sometimes it's based on the society around them, the primitiveness of the society around them, the sophistication of the society around them. Sometimes hated because we're rich, sometimes because we're poor. Marx spoke about us being the representatives of the capitalists, Hitler representatives of the communists. Voltaire spoke about us because of our hanging on to a superstitious faith. Others spoke about us, the problem being that we are integrated and assimilated within society. Stalin spoke about us being rootless cosmopolitans. It doesn't seem almost to be an ideology at all, but almost just a stream of perspective and guttural instincts rather than anything else. Rabbi Sachs famously described it as a virus, something that's topical and understandable in the pandemic, as almost something that attaches itself and infects people and mutates in order to survive. And just like there's an immune system which we have, which protects us from viruses, similarly there should be an immune system within human consciousness that protects from ideologies of hatred. And yet this immune system would seem to be the natural sense of justice and fairness and equity that people should possess. And yet somehow anti-Semitism mutates to allow it to exist in human consciousness no matter what, by finding ways of self-justification to somehow justify its existence. And if we look at the range of how anti-Semitism has expressed itself, it really has varied through the years. Long before the birth of religious anti-Semitism, we're aware of anti-Semitism almost as a fundamental hostility towards Jews. We find this in Tanakh, particularly perhaps personified by Haman, Some of the other figures in Tanakh who persecute us may have been doing so in the pursuit of power or empire building, like Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrians. But certainly when it comes to Haman, it would seem he's driven just by hatred of the Jews. And we find already pre-religious hatred of the Jews, there was a Greek, almost xenophobic hatred of the Jews. But certainly this sort of came to the fore as specific anti-Semitism when we look at some of the writings of the Christian church fathers. And in the source box, I wrote and I'll post again the link to the sources for those who have joined later. If anyone wants to download this, in the source sheet, I linked to some of the classic lines of Christian anti-Semitism, including Matthew with his ideology that somehow Jews as a collective were responsible for the murder of their supposed savior. Let his blood be on our heads, he quotes the Jews saying, and the heads of our children. There's somehow a inherited liability and responsibility. In John, he writes, why do you not understand what I say? Is it because you cannot hear my words? You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father, in other words, the devil's desire. The reason you do not hear the words of God is because you are not of God. And the church father, Origen, says, we can say with confidence that they, meaning the Jews, will never be restored to their former condition, for they committed a crime of the most unhallowed kind. So this idea that Jews are somehow responsible for rejection of faith and belief is something quite deeply embedded in some areas of Christian theology. I want again to go into the issue of to what degree this is a consensus amongst Christian founding fathers, but certainly there's a strong thread of this. In the Quran similarly, there's found quotes in which Jews are somehow blamed collectively for rejection of the faith. It's because on account of their breaking their covenant, we cast them and made their hearts hard. But God, Allah, has cast them on account of their unbelief. So they do not believe but a little. It says humiliation and wretchedness was stamped upon them and they were visited with wrath from Allah, from God, because they disbelieved his revelations and killed the prophets wrongfully, etc. So there's a strong sort of trend of religious criticism, collective criticism of Jews for their disbelief. Something that both in Christianity and Islam took on. A second stage that took place was in the medieval era, when Jews were blamed for almost being demonic. Not only did they reject Christianity, but they were somehow engaged in evil plots. These were the accusations of the blood libel, killing children, poisoning wells, spreading the plague, desecration of the host, and the whole next stage of forced conversions and inquisitions and book burnings and expulsions, which really hadn't taken place in the first millennia of Christian-Jewish coexistence to the same degree. And this was a second stage that took place. And the crucial point in both of these is that the justification found for this is in seats of authority. This is a religious need. This is justified in religion and therefore somehow okay. And again, in the source sheet, I printed a quote from as late as 1882 from a semi-official Christian publication in which it writes, every practice in Hebrew worthy of the name is obliged to use in food and drink and various other rites of religious and civil life, the fresh blood of a Christian child and so on. So these are lies that really deeply embedded in Christian Europe consciousness, and tragically also crossed into the Muslim and Arabic-speaking world, in which they adopted some of these Christian stereotypes. The Hamas Charter in 1988 references the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the idea that Jews are behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, the First World War, the Second World War, financial gains in trading, in armaments, etc. This was explicit in delegations to the UN, in which the Talmud is quoted as supposedly saying every year we have to drink the blood of a non-Jew, etc. So this is a sort of morphing of the ideology into the Jew being claimed as something demonic. Fascinatingly and tragically, with the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of respect for science, so as religion begins ceasing to be a source of authority and therefore a justification for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism yet again morphs and changes, this time adopting a pseudo-scientific coat, because it needs to appeal yet again to the source of authority. And this time, what justifies prejudice? Scientific theories of pseudo-Darwinism, of somehow there being racial characteristics which are integral to different races and features of the races, and racial anti-Semitism based upon this sort of idea of Darwinism, survival of the fittest, inherited racial characteristics. And again, in the sources I posted a terrible quote from Voltaire, who is perhaps the single most famous figure in Enlightenment, almost the representative of the rise of reason and science, who speaks about Jews as being a totally ignorant nation, who've combined contemptible miserliness with the most revolting superstition, a violent hatred of all the nations that have tolerated them. And then, in an appeal for fairness, he says, nonetheless, they should not be burnt at the stake. A remarkable and terrible line. So we see again it sort of morphing into in each generation, and somehow attaching to the gods of the time, to the sources of authority of the time, whether that is religion or whether it's pseudo-scientific philosophy. And of course, we're now living through yet another stage in which it no longer is about religion, it's not even about race, but now it's about nationhood. So the sort of cause of anti-nationalism, anti-equality, and liberalism is being twisted and morphed and perverted into somehow justifying attacks on the state of Israel and on the right to Jews to have their own nation and on attacks of Jews, and the old same sort of anti-Semitic myths are being recreated in new forms. They're no longer blood libels, but these are now used as if as a legitimate attack. Of all the nations in the world, only one isn't entitled to its own state. So what we have here is a phenomena which is almost unique in many elements. It has unique longevity. It's the longest hatred that we are aware of in history. It has a universalism about it, experienced everywhere where Jews have lived, almost without exception. It seems to have a sort of permanence. It seems to linger. It has a remarkable intensity of a depth of hate, and it's built around irrationality and fantasy and conspiracy theories almost in a remarkable way. So these are the features of the phenomena that we're looking at. Now what are we meant to make of all of this? How are we meant to process this? And is there anything meaningful we can say about this? And here again, I want to repeat my opening statements that by definition, in a limited amount of time available, anything said is going to be narrow and somewhat superficial. Nonetheless, I think there are worthwhile things that we should comment upon. There are worthwhile things that we should say. And I want to turn to the first source that almost discusses hatred in our literature, in and of in itself, just as a fundamental, deep-rooted hatred of the Jewish people. And this is the words of Haman in Megillas Esther, in Perek Gimel, in chapter 3, in which Haman says to Achashverosh in a very famous line, Vayomer Haman lemelech Achashverosh, Yeshna am echad, there is one people, mefuzar mefored bein ha'amim, scattered amongst the nations, v'doseim shonos mechalom, their religion is different, their laws are different to any other people. There's Dasei HaMelech Ein Amosim, they don't keep the Datei HaMelech, the laws of the king. They're different, they're others. There's something otherness about the Jew, and this is the root of hatred. And Haman really is the most classic anti-Semite that we find in the time of Tanakh. We don't really find another figure who just fits in a classical sense, pure anti-Semitism, rather than there not being any other national or empire building motive to this. And this concept of otherness and differentness, I think, is one that deserves a little bit of exploring. First of all, it's a theme picked up in many of our classic sources who reference and discuss the idea of anti-Semitism. And in preparing this year, I collated a vast array of classic Jewish thinkers that address this topic. And I'm not going to have time to share all of them, but on the sources I printed a couple of references. The first is a Gemara in Masechah Shabbos, which is midrashically interpreting the name of Mount Sinai. Why, says the Gemara, it was the Torah given on a mountain called Sinai, and it puns the word Sinai, linking it to Sinah, or hatred, and it says, my Har Sinai. What is the meaning of Har Sinai? Shemisham Yard of Sinah L'Umos Olam. Because through the revelation that took place at Sinai, Sinah, hatred descended against us to the peoples of the world. So the Gemara here seems to be ascribing hatred to do, again, in line really with the psukim in the Megillah, to differences and differentness. There's a very remarkable letter from the Rambam in which he wrote to the people of Yemen. People of Yemen at the time were suffering extraordinary persecution. We're talking here in the late 1160s, early 1170s. An incredible letter to read, and one that I would recommend. It's available online, both in Hebrew and English, if one has time to have a look at it. There was a Yemenite ruler at the time called Abd al-Nabi ibn Mahdi, who basically in Yemen in the late 1160s gave the Jews the choice of conversion or martyrdom, conversion to Islam at the time, or martyrdom. And the Yemenite Jewish community wrote a letter to the Rambam, who of course was up the Gulf in Egypt, appealing to him for help, both spiritual and political. The Rambam was associated with a figure known as Al-Nasir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin, to us, and they asked Saladin to intervene, which indeed he does, and he sends his brother to conquer Yemen and take it away from the fundamentalist ideology of Ibn Mahdi, who I mentioned already. And also the Rambam pens a letter of encouragement to the Jews of Yemen, who are enormously appreciative and adopt the Rambam as their spiritual guide. They are the only community in the world, by the way, who follows consistently the halachic ruling of the Rambam. The rest of us follow the Shulchan Aruch, which often follows the Rambam, but not always. The Yemenite community adopt the Rambam as really the last word in halacha. He has enormous influence on them philosophically also, and they really appreciated this Igeret Teiman, this letter or epistle to Yemen that the Rambam wrote. And in this letter, the Rambam discusses again the phenomena of anti-Semitism which they're grappling with, and he adapts and builds upon the words, these midrashic terms of the Gemara, and he speaks about a similar idea, and he says, look, we've been separated off, and that arises hatred and dislike. Separation is something which has the potential to cause hatred and anti-Semitism. Now, by this point, we should be reflecting a little bit on this. Are we comfortable with that message? What do we make of it? And is it, if it's a true one, does that mean that difference is a negative thing? Is this a bad thing? Is there any insight that can be achieved in this? Does this give us any direction in how to go forward? And what does it mean to be fundamentally different? Now, in truth, everyone is different. Every human being is different, and every nation has its differences. But there's no doubt that Jews are amongst the most ancient people in the world, who in a succession of different kingdoms and dispersion and empires and societies have stubbornly refused to assimilate into the dominant culture. And this is something that was already spoken about in classic antiquity. And again, in the source sheets, I wrote a couple of quotes from, I think I put one quote actually in, from Tacitus, a renowned Roman historian from the first century of the Common Era, who wrote about this. And he says, really in remarkably similar words to Haman. It's just amazing to see the persistence of the sort of language used in anti-Semitic libel, which seems somehow also to be reflected in our sources, acknowledge that this perhaps is the source of anti-Semitism. He says they reveal a stubborn attachment to one another with an implacable hatred of the rest of mankind. They sit apart at meals, they sleep apart, they won't marry us. They regard as profane anything that we think is sacred. And then he says they regard as a crime to kill a newborn infant. So at the time in Rome, it was considered acceptable to kill a newborn infant who was perhaps helpless and wasn't seen as having a chance of survival. And this is immoral, that they see it wrong of to kill an unborn infant, and so go on many other classic sources in antiquities, in the ancient world. So again, it would appear that at least a significant factor in hatred is because we were conspicuous throughout the ages as different. In Christian Europe, we were really the sole minority that people met. We were the sole significant non-Christian population that remained non-Christian in Europe. And similarly in the Middle East, we were the sole, most conspicuous non-Muslim community in the Middle East. Hatred because we were different. Now, here we get to something which is fundamental and something that we need to think about. Because if this is the case, then an anti-Semitism is driven by a dislike of the other, then it's telling us something more profound about the nature of the society that engages in anti-Semitism. And here I think we should talk a little bit about what it means in essence to be a Jew. Now, the classic term for a Jew in the Torah is that of Ivri, a Hebrew. The term Jew that we use nowadays derives its origin from Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah, later used in the latter books of Tanakh, but classically in the Torah referred to as Ivrim. Now, what is the translation of the word Ivri? So Chazal put forward 3 suggestions. The first is they say this is about geographical origin. We come from Eva Hana, from the other side of the river. This is referring to the river Tigris and Euphrates. Our origin is in Mesopotamia, and like many modern ethnicities or surnames, our name was linked to our place where we came from. This would seem to be the simplest translation. Avram Avinu is called Avram HaIvri because he was an Ivri. He came from a region of the world referred to as Eva Hana, the other side of, not the Jordan in this case, but the other side of the large river. We come from Mesopotamia. He migrated through the crescent, the Fertile Crescent, and ended up in Israel, and therefore is referred to as the Hebrew, the Ivri, from the other side of the river. Then a second etymology is suggested by the sages, in which they say maybe this is an ethnic origin or a tribal name. We are descendants of Ava. Shem and Ava, we call ourselves Semites after the figure Shem, but we could equally call ourselves Ivrim after the figure Ava. We are descendant of Ava, an ancestor of Avram, one of the descendants of Shem, the son of Noach, a second suggestion of the name. And then the sages seem to give what we would think is a metaphorical interpretation of the name, a midrashic interpretation of the name. And they say the meaning of the word Ivri is we come from the other side, the other bank. Wherever we find ourselves, we're always on the other side. We're always on the metaphorical other side of the river, with other, that which is different. Now, for many years, I thought this was the least literal translation of the name, and that this was a midrashic interpretation. Ava means the other side of the river, not as an ethnic identity, not as a geographical identity, but as an otherness. We have an idea and a belief system which is different. Remarkably, after reading, I discovered that actually this is possibly the most literal origin of the etymology of the word. We now know that there's a Proto-Semitic word which was used indeed by the Egyptians to refer to alien migrants, in which they referred to them as Aviu. This isn't the time for a detailed discussion, but the Egyptians were a settled civilization who were bothered by the wandering nomadic strangers that used to enter into their lands, of whom a significant immigration was, of course, our ancestors, as per the story of the exile in Egypt and the Exodus. And they referred to these strangers as Aviu, as Ivri. So it would appear that the literal meaning of the word Aviu, in this interpretation of Chazal, perhaps not meant midrashically, but literally meant etymologically, and so it would seem from the Egyptian use of the word, means an alien, an other. We are the eternal aliens. We are the eternal others. No matter which society we find ourselves in, we shouldn't exactly integrate. We shouldn't completely be part of it. We shouldn't completely identify and lose our own sense of identity. We need to be confident in our own values. We're always meant to be the counterculture, the society that can hold up a mirror to the world and say, but is this quite so? Perhaps there's another way of looking at it. We're always meant to be the voice that questions the assumptions of society and says, is this so obvious? Is this the way it's meant to be? To be a Jew, to be an Ivri, is to have the confidence to assert we are contributing to society, we value society, we love our neighbours, we want to give, but we also reserve the right to be different. We reserve the right to question and to challenge. The privilege, and I say this always to the teens that I teach in school, one of the privileges of being a Jew is that we're forced to think about identity. We're forced to think about what we mean and what we are. We're forced to be comfortable in our own skins, being something a little different to the rest of society. For an average teen, perhaps we don't need to think a lot about what it means to be British or English. But for a Jewish teen, we're forced to think about how do we juggle multiple identities and what does it mean to be part of both a broad society and also part of Judaism. To have the confidence to walk out of an office early on a Friday afternoon, to have the confidence to, in the centre of town, stand by the side and daven mincha if we realise the clock is ticking and times have passed. It builds in us the ability to question, to be a little different, to challenge assumptions, and to be able to assert a perspective that isn't obvious and intuitive to everyone else around. But perhaps this is part of the Jewish ability to sit round a board meeting and have everyone assert one particular view and then be able to question and say, but maybe that's not correct. Maybe there's another way of looking at it. This is integral to what it means to be an Ivri, to be the other, the eternal alien. And now we get to the fundamental question. What happens when a society isn't able to tolerate difference? What happens when a society says, we're not able to accept that there are others who don't wish to be identical to us? Not because they're doing anything wrong, not because they're not good citizens, not because they're not contributing, but just because they're different. We're not comfortable with those who perhaps force ourselves to look in the mirror and challenge ourselves because they're different. We can't tolerate difference. Perhaps we don't want difference in individuals, and we certainly don't want difference in others collectively. And such a society is on the route to descent into chaos, into destruction. Such a society is descending into destroying itself. In Rabbi Sax's words, we are the canary in the coal mine. We are the first alarm bell, the warning bell that something is going wrong. Because when a society turns against those who most symbolize difference, it worries us. It means it's edging towards an inability to accept difference. And if it can't accept difference, it will consume itself. Ultimately, it will consume itself with hatred. It will use the other as an excuse to justify its own failings. It won't be able to look at itself critically in the mirror and ask, where are we going right and where are we going wrong? It will need to turn on the other rather than facing up to its own limitations, and it will become static and ultimately descend into decay and decadence because it won't be able to change, because it doesn't give space for questioning. It doesn't give space for minority view. It doesn't give space for genuine conversation, discussion and debate, space for difference of opinion. So ultimately, that which is dangerous in anti-Semitism isn't just the effect that it has on us, but because it doesn't just destroy the victim of the hatred, it also ultimately destroys the hater. If we're unwilling to accept difference, then ultimately we will destroy and corrode our own society. We will destroy ourselves. And this is such a powerful message, because if we think that the route to resolve anti-Semitism is to negate the difference, then we are selling ourselves out. We are losing the very gift of what it means to be an Ivri, to be an other. And we're abdicating our responsibility to be that canary in the coal mine, to be that figure that deserves to be tolerated. A society which can't tolerate difference is tragic. A society which can't deal with that difference is heading to destruction. Ultimately, anti-Semitism isn't about us as Jews. We're the objects of it, but not its cause. Ultimately, it's to do with a breakdown in the society that is harboring the anti-Semitism. And I want at this point for us to look at the very famous opening words when Hashem turns to Avraham Avinu, Avraham Ivri, our founder, Abraham, who is referred to as the Ivri, and he gives him his first mission. His first mission to do what and to be what? To wander into other nations, to go and exile himself from his home in Mesopotamia and head elsewhere, to travel along the Fertile Crescent and land up in the land of Israel. And therefore we're looking at the very first pasuk in Lech Lecha, and again I printed this on the source sheets and the link was posted in the chat. Hashem turns to Avram and he says, Lech lecha mi'atzcha mi'ladetcha mi'beis avicha. Go, leave your home, your land, your birthplace, the house of your father, El Oretz Asher to the land that I will show you. In other words, be the stranger, leave home and become that Ivri. And then what will happen? V'avorecha mevarecha. Though I will bless those who bless you, u'makalelcha o'or, and I will curse those who curse you. Meaning there will be those who bless you. There will be those who are able to tolerate you, even though you're a stranger, even though you're different, even though you're the other. And there will be those who hate you because they're unable to tolerate the one who is different, the one who is other. But the one who blesses you, I will bless, and the one who curses you, I will curse. Now the Rambam, Maimonides, in his Guide to the Perplexed, is of the opinion that whenever we see such language, we should not view this as God tweaking and intervening in history. God created a perfect world that doesn't need miraculous tweaking constantly. He built into the fabric of the world consequences. Good is, the rewards of good, all else being equal, is built into the fabric of the world. A society which has values of morality and ethics and decency will prosper. And a society which has built into it corrosion and corruption has built into itself the seeds of its own destruction. And therefore he translates the Pasuk as, yes, those who bless you I will bless, because that's built into the laws of society, of sociology, of nature. A nation which can tolerate others will flourish, but those who curse you I will curse, because built into, fundamental to a nation, a society, which has lost its ability to tolerate difference, is the seeds of self-destruction, is the seeds of a nation which has lost the ability to critique itself, to accept difference, to have confidence in its own skin, that not everyone is the same, to tolerate difference, and in so doing, tolerate creativity, tolerate criticism, tolerate reflection, tolerate the other, and be able to change and grow, and not seek to scapegoat someone in order to justify its own inner failings. And therefore, in this reading, the difference that is seen as a root of anti-Semitism, it is something we need to embrace. We need to live in a world, we can't give up on that, in a world that can accept difference, because this is part of our mission to humanity. Our role in sharing the values of Torah and mitzvahs that we've been given includes sharing the possibility of there being an Ivri, of the one who's other, who's able to critically step back and look at the assumptions, the political correctnesses, the norms of the time, and accept that these should be challenged. Now, I want to use the few minutes that are left available to me to try and see a remarkable reflection of this idea in the halachic system. Because what we're arguing is that to try and erase differences as a response to anti-Semitism may or may not be effective. That's an interesting sociological or political discussion, but in essence is an abdication of our responsibility as Jews, and in fact letting society down, because in so doing we're not forcing it to confront its inner failures. And this is reflected in a fascinating halacha in Shulchan Aruch, and sourced in a range of questions, halachic questions, that have been asked over the years. And the question is about the legitimacy of concealing Jewish identity in response to anti-Semitism. This is a question that has been asked for the last 1,000 years or more of Jewish history. Is it appropriate to conceal our Jewishness as a response to anti-Semitism? And this can be as simple as communal policy. Should we be encouraging the wearing of caps when going into town rather than walking out in our kippot? And it can be on a larger scale too. These are questions asked in the Middle Ages by Jewish businessmen and ladies who wanted to travel on business trips and were banned from entering certain German towns during the Middle Ages. These were questions asked by Moranos in Spain. These were questions asked in the Holocaust about the legitimacy of allowing the initials RC, Roman Catholic, to be stamped on one's passport in order to avoid being identified as a Jew. And these are questions that have been asked about people who wish to trade and visit Arab lands and are not allowed to do so unless they fill in a form in which they declare that they are Christian or Muslim, and no option is given for being Jewish. So these are discussed in the classic halachic sources. And again, with the time available, I'm not going to go through these inside, but on the source sheets, I printed a quote from the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch brings, based on his understanding of earlier sources, that a person is not allowed to deny Jewish identity when challenged, even at risk to life and limb. A remarkable statement. Now, this is a complex halachic matter, and it's one that needs to be explored more fully. But the Shulchan Aruch is arguing that we are used to the idea of the three cardinal sins. For almost everything, we should, rather than risk our lives and lose our lives, we should rather breach halacha. So Shabbat, someone falls ill, break Shabbos in order to save their life. Yom Kippur, eat on Yom Kippur in order to save someone's life. There are three cardinal sins about which this doesn't apply. Idol worship, denial of acceptance of paganism, murder, how can I murder one person to save myself, and immorality, a breakdown in moral boundaries and the family. These are the three areas that supersede life. Says the Shulchan Aruch, to explicitly deny Jewish identity is the same. If one is given the choice of declaring oneself not to be Jewish, one is not allowed to do so. This is a fundamental breach of our mission to create Kiddush Hashem, to spread belief without fear and not to deny God. In essence, to deny our uniqueness and the uniqueness of identity is a desecration of our God's name and of our mission, a denial of difference, and this is so integral to our identity as people and our mission as well that this is something that can't be done. Now, this is qualified by the poskim, and again, it's a broader discussion. It's certainly the case that if one can be vague and say something which can be understood in either way, one is allowed to do so. One doesn't have to explicitly declare it. The Ramah says that one can be deliberately vague. He also says that one can change one's, the Shulchan Aruch says one can change clothing so that one isn't visibly Jewish, but to explicitly deny Jewish identity, according to this halachic opinion, is an example of something equivalent to one of the other three cardinal sins, because it's integral to what we are. The Ramah then carries on and says that even change of clothing should only be in times of danger. Don't do it just to facilitate business. Don't do it just to avoid more minor anti-Jewish legislation. Be proud of what you are. The response to anti-Semitism cannot be denial of identity unless it's a situation literally of threat to life. But otherwise, says the Ramah, don't change one's clothing in order to cover up identity. I printed in the final source, and with this I will conclude, a record from a book known as Sefer HaChasidim, the Book of the Pious, written by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, a medieval German halachic and Kabbalistic authority, who declares that if one is mistakenly viewed by someone else as a Gentile, one should let one know, no, I'm Jewish. One should have the confidence to assert this. And he links this to a story of Moshe, where Moshe arrives at the well after fleeing Egypt and is identified by the daughters of Yisro, or Jethro, as being an Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian, and he doesn't respond, and he's criticized by Chazal for not doing. He should have reacted. He shouldn't have tolerated this mistake in his identity. There should be a declaration of pride. No, I'm not an Egyptian. I am an Ish Ivri. I am the Aviru. I am the other. I am this wandering nomad who doesn't exactly fit in to the settled culture and life of Egypt. So this is a halachic discussion of the same core ideas reflected in the philosophical thinking of the Rambam, based on the Gemara, some of the writings of Rabbi Sachs, and remarkably also expressed in halachic terminology through the writings of the Shulchan Aruch and others. I will stop there, given that I've spoken for my 50 minutes. I see there's a couple of questions that have come up on the group. One question is, are we Jews not as guilty of the same thing when it comes to tolerating different sects within Judaism, especially sects that choose to live differently and separate themselves from the rest? I would answer yes. I mean, I agree with that. We absolutely should ensure that we are open to hearing other voices, and equally that we do not let legitimate disagreement over views ever translate into hatred of the other, God forbid. I would exactly agree with that. We should not allow our differences of views that divide us as Jews to descend into something analogous to hatred and the lack of self-confidence and the ability to confidently believe in what we do without blaming others. And similarly, we shouldn't translate, we shouldn't use others as an excuse for our own failures. If the Jewish community or Jews go through a difficult time internally, we shouldn't be turning externally to blame it on another sort of Jew. We should always voice opportunities for improvement about that is relevant to ourselves rather than needing to scapegoat others, no doubt about that. There's much more to say about this, including, of course, that when confronting anti-Semitism, we do need to fight it, we do need to make representation, we need to use the advocacy that we have available and the outreach to government. I started off by thanking Susan for facilitating this share. I would thank her for her role as our deputy in the board of deputies that does work in this area. Of course, there's much else to be said, but I hope this presents one perspective of anti-Semitism from our sources and some of the implications or responses to it. I'll stop there, and actually I see more questions are coming through in the chat. Susan, maybe I'll pause to allow if there's any live questions, and then I'll turn back to some of the chat questions.
First
of all, Susan, let me repeat my thanks to you, because I know you are a strong voice in this area. I'm here referring where safe to do so, both externally standing up and expressing our views, and internally we cannot alter ourselves in order to deal with this. The solution here is not the victims changing themselves. It's recognition that we have to call upon society, our friends in society, to stand up. Because if we let this pass, not only will, God forbid, we be affected, but equally, God forbid, the societies that host us will crumble and be destroyed. The rise of anti-Semitism in the West is a terrifying wake-up call of a deeper moral failure and breakdown in society that is occurring. And I have to say, we need to challenge it. And when it's safe to do so, we absolutely should. I was walking the Heath a week ago and with my kids, and there were 4 youths who, as we passed, started chanting "Free Palestine." And there were enough people around that I didn't feel unsafe to do so, and I challenged them in a respectful and decent way. And I said to them, look, I understand you're very upset about the situation over there, but why would you start chanting that when I pass? Like, what are you trying to say? And remarkably, within about 30 seconds, they A, confessed to me they knew nothing about the situation in Palestine, and B, actually said to me, you know what, we're deeply ashamed of what we've done. And we didn't stop to think about what this must feel like to you, and apologized. And I have no reason to doubt their sincerity. It seemed to be very sincere. So we do have to stand up. We have to stand up and we have to respond. Here, I'm not just speaking about external response, which is absolutely vital and important, but also our internal confidence in the message that we still have to deliver. We cannot feel that Judaism can only be an acceptable message to the world when it fits in with every value of society around us. It, by definition, has to say something countercultural. We are meant to be Ivrim. We're meant to be saying something that's a little different, to open to the best, and open to new ideas, and open to the insight of modernity, which has a lot to offer, but also equally able to recognize the power of our tradition and what that has to say. So yeah, absolutely, I would agree with that. Couple questions have come through from on the chat, which I'll take, and then again, if anyone wants to ask something live, please feel free to do so. Was the Enlightenment movement created in the 19th century to be one part of the Gentile society and helped avoid anti-Semitism, which of course didn't help? Okay, so this is a broader discussion. In the 19th century, there were many movements and attempts to respond to the challenge of anti-Semitism. Some successfully so, some less successfully so. I'm not going to go into all of them. The Enlightenment movement in the Jewish world was somewhat a response to genuinely believing there was insight in modernity from which we could gain, and somewhat was seen as an attempt, yes, to deal with anti-Semitism, as were some other movements, including Jewish involvement in communism, in Bundism, in Zionism. There were many movements that were attempting to solve anti-Semitism, and each of them needs to be measured in their own right and looked at in their own context. So there's a discussion in its own right, Jewish responses to anti-Semitism through the ages. What we can say is that unfortunately none of them have been proven to be capable of eradicating anti-Semitism. Obviously they can, some of them have been somewhat helpful, some have been less than helpful in dealing with them, but none of them have succeeded in eradicating anti-Semitism, because fundamentally the solution to anti-Semitism does not lie solely in our hands. It lies in hopefully a positive direction for which we daven and pray that society will take. Someone else posted me a question saying, is anti-Semitism divinely ordained? This is a very good and fascinating question. it gets us into philosophical questions about what we mean by divinely ordained and what sort of world we live in. So I'll simply say that, at least in the thinking of the Rambam, no, it absolutely is not divinely ordained. It is true that it can be a reflection of our own internal state of affairs and external matters. But fundamentally, our role as Jews is to be the voice of morality to the world, and therefore it's intertwined in our nature as Ivrim that we can attract anti-Semitism. We can be the objects of hatred, and the first, as I said, the first litmus test, the first warning indicator that something is going wrong. But the question of what's divinely ordained probably gets into broader issues, which I discuss in my Sunday morning philosophy series, the divide between the Kabbalists and the philosophers about how one views the interaction of God with the world. Okay, I think I'll call it a day there. There are more questions actually coming in, so maybe I'll just try and take, in fact, 2 people just wrote to me questions about the statement of Esav Sones Yaakov, halacha, that's Esav Sones Yaakov. This is a statement found in Chazal, made famous by being quoted in Rashi, that Esav hates Yaakov, and the language seems to be this is a halacha, this is something fundamentally built into the fabric of creation. There's a lot to say about this particular quote in Chazal, both whether it actually means what it's seen as saying, which is this is somehow endemic to the cosmos, or whether this is merely a phenomenon that existed at the time of Esav and Yaakov, and secondly, whether the correct interpretation is to the degree that Esav chooses to adopt the behavior of Esav and resist a message of morality, then hatred is inevitable. But were Esav to choose to revert back to the partnership, which was the original plan for creation, in which all peoples, Jews and non-Jews, would walk hand in hand towards recognition of Hashem, then that wouldn't occur. And let's not forget that we daven on Rosh Hashanah, V'yeh Sifchol, we sing it, we daven it at the end of Aleinu. Throughout our tefillah and our requests, we daven for a world in which we'll be able to go back to genuine partnership with all peoples in morality and in service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zobin. Such a powerful, thought-provoking, profound analysis of anti-Semitism and sharing so many dilemmas with us in such a sensitive way. We're very grateful to you. Thank you. And thank you once again for all your steadfast support for our series. Next Sunday evening, there is no shir because it's Shavasa B'Tammuz. The next shir will be in 2 weeks' time, where we have 3 speakers from our Lahava group from Ner Israel of young women. We have Tamara Ezekiel, Michaela Mann, and Eilet Besso-Cowan speaking on what does Hashem want from us, the 3 fundamentals. They'll be speaking on 1 each. If anyone wants to make a dedication for any share, let me know or Naomi Landy know. And thank you so much again, Rabbi Zobin. All very grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.